So, we have to talk about Gen Z. Everybody seems to think this generation gap is bigger than ever and unprecedented or completely overrated. But what if it's actually not? What if this is a sign of social progress? So, while I was working on another project, I kept circling back to this same question. I've been sketching out an idea I've been calling Society 2.0. Not really a manifesto or a plan, but more of a thought experiment. A way of asking what a society might look like if it were designed around the realities we actually live in now, rather than the assumptions we inherited from the past, right? It's sort of a world shaped by digital life, longer transitions to adulthood, weaker institutions, and a lot more individual choice with a lot more uncertainty. And it kind of got me thinking. We wouldn't really be talking about a Society 2.0 if Society 1.0 still felt like it was a good fit for us. And for a lot of people, especially younger generations, it really doesn't. Which led me to an intellectual puzzle that I couldn't get past. Why does the generational gap around Gen Z feel so large? And why does it dominate so much of our cultural conversation right now? All right, so before we talk about Gen Z specifically, it's worth stating something super basic. Generational gaps aren't new, they've always existed. Imagine two brothers born into the same family, same parents, same house, same neighborhood, same socioeconomic class, literally the same everything. Okay? One difference. One is born in the 1890s, the other is born in the early 1900s. On paper, they should be nearly identical until history intervenes. The older brother comes of age just in time to be drafted into the First World War. He experiences mass mobilization, industrialized violence, and the collapse of all sorts of old promises and systems. The younger brother misses the war entirely. He grows up in its aftermath instead, shaped by stories, not trauma. Even in the same household, these two men would likely see authority, risk, and the future very differently. I have on the screen now the stories of these two brothers that I just made up. The older one is born, becomes a soldier in World War One, and leaves, hoping it really is the war to end all wars. Younger brother goes to school, misses the war entirely, and grows up to be like hawkishly supporting the nation in World War II, maybe. The difference isn't a moral failure by either of them. Neither brother is really correct. It's just a product of lived experience. So, obviously, if it can happen to two brothers in the same family, then it can happen to two completely separate generations. So, with all of that being said, when people talk about a gap between Gen Z and previous generations, they're obviously not imagining it. Gen Z grew up under a very specific set of conditions. For many of them, a global pandemic disrupted school, work, and their social life during their formative years. And they've come of age with climate change not as some abstract future problem, but as like a background assumption. Economically, they entered adulthood during a period of high housing costs, rising debt, and declining trust that effort alone leads to stability. And technologically, they are the first generation to experience algorithmic systems like social media, recommendation engines, constant connectivity, not as tools, but as an environments, a digital environment. None of that makes Gen Z better or worse. It just makes them different than previous generations, which makes me question whether the media hype around the generational gap isn't just a bunch of hype. So, even if it is all hype, clearly the differences are real. We've already covered that. But that raises the more interesting question. Is this generational gap actually larger than the ones that came before it, or does it just feel larger? And if so, why? All right, so here's my theory then. What if generational gaps don't just exist, but sometimes appear larger because other kinds of social gaps are becoming less central? Over the last several decades, divisions around race, religion, gender, and ethnicity haven't disappeared, but in many places they've lost some of their legitimacy as the primary way we explain social conflict. I'm not saying inequality is solved, just saying that certain differences are no longer really either acceptable or nearly as useful as they were. In that context, generation becomes a safer and more visible stand in for talking about frustration, change, and power without reopening older and much more dangerous lines of division. To make a really, really long story short, basically you can say okay, boomer a lot louder than you can say okay, followed by a different B word. So I'm not denying that other differences exist. I'm merely saying that differences have become a lot louder in some areas than in others. So the first social gap I want to touch on is race, which is usually something Americans don't want to talk about for one of two reasons. One is that they want to pretend that we as a society have no remnants of racism left, we've smashed it to pieces, and we should all be colorblind from here on out. Two is they're uncomfortable discussing problems because they think it's just impossible to solve, everything is horrible, and that's just the way the world is. Now, if we're being honest, usually it's going to be the first option, and they just don't want to acknowledge it's still there. But race is actually a beautiful illustration of my point here. Let's start by looking at progress we've made. Over the last century, the civil rights movement fundamentally reshaped society. Schools and neighborhoods started to be desegregated, the military was integrated, legal protections got expanded, and while far from perfect, these changes have reduced the most overt forms of racial hostility, creating opportunities for more interaction and understanding between groups. Second, Generation Z is the last generation that's going to identify as a majority white in the US, because roughly 49% of the generation identifies as BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That means that for the first time, at a large scale, cross-racial differences aren't they're less sharp simply because the generation is far more racially diverse. Gen Z experiences diversity as a default, not as the exception. Another shift in how racism manifests is it's increasingly institutional rather than interpersonal. That obviously doesn't mean it's gone. The policies, the housing, white flight, economic structures, they still reproduce disparities, but it does reduce everyday hostility between individuals and open the door for more cross-cultural exchange. And of course, the work isn't done. I can't stress that enough. Inequality persists, and racism has evolved rather than disappeared. But 2 points give reason for cautious optimism. The first is that Gen Z actively opposes institutions and systems that perpetuate inequality, and the second is that racist movements seem to start targeting the generation with the highest percentage of BIPOC individuals rather than challenging the racial equality directly, which seems everything seems to suggest that the old system recognizes it would lose in open battle and is trying its best to operate in the shadows. Now, if that is true, that's a signal that racism as an overt system is waning, and progress, however incomplete, is real. This supports my idea that the generation gap isn't necessarily bigger than ever, but rather it looks bigger because the racial gap is smaller than it used to be. And that's going to apply to our next social gap as well, which is going to be gender. So, gender is another place where long term change matters. Over the last century, women's rights have expanded steadily with access to education, political representation, workplace participation, and legal autonomy. These changes didn't happen all at once, and they're, still incomplete, but the overall direction has been pretty clear. Compared to earlier generations, men and women today are far closer to parity in daily life, expectations, and opportunity, especially within the same age group. At the same time, movements like feminism and the LGBTQ plus rights movement have increasingly converged around a shared idea. Gender should describe who you are, not determine what you're allowed to do. That shift doesn't erase difference, but it does reduce hierarchy. And when gender becomes less decisive as a social boundary, people within the same generation are more likely to see each other as peers rather than opposites. There is still work to be done. Inequality hasn't disappeared, can never stress that enough. But as gender loses its role as a primary divider, it creates space for stronger connections within generations and fewer inherited conflicts between them. This is the same as race above, and it's going to be the same for our next social gap I'm going to talk about, religion. Now, religion has long been one of the most powerful social dividing lines. But over time, its role has been changing. Across much of the developed world, formal religious participation has declined, while atheism, agnosticism, and more individualized forms of spirituality have increased. For younger generations, especially, religion is less likely to function as a rigid identity that dictates social roles, politics, or who you're allowed to associate with. At the same time, there's been a slow but meaningful turn away from fundamentalism and strict orthodoxy. Not everywhere and not uniformly, but enough to change the cultural landscape. That shift has made space for more cross religious dialogue, pluralism, and peaceful coexistence. Differences remain, but they're less likely to define everyday relationships or justify open hostility. Religion hasn't disappeared, and quite frankly, it won't. But as it becomes more personal and less prescriptive, it loses some of its power as a primary social fault line. And when religion matters less as a dividing identity, people within the same generation are freer to connect across belief systems without feeling like those differences define who they are. Now, there is one factor that cuts both ways: geography. Geography still matters, and globally, the difference between regions and countries remain significant. Economic conditions, political systems, and local histories continue to shape people's lives in very different ways depending on where they live. At the same time, globalization has changed how these differences are experienced. Ideas, aesthetics, grievances, and movements now cross borders far more easily than before. When Gen Z led protests appear in places as different as Nepal, Madagascar, and Bulgaria, it can create the impression of a single global generation, even though the local causes and conditions are often very different. The same pattern exists within countries. Urban and rural areas, coastal and interior regions, wealthy and struggling communities, they still diverge sharply. But across those divides, members of the same generation increasingly share cultural reference points, media environments, and expectations about the future. Geography hasn't disappeared as a source of difference, it's just been partially overlaid by generational similarity, making generational identity feel larger and more unified than it actually is. Alright, my next point is going to make a lot of Americans uncomfortable: class. We like to pretend that we don't have a class system, but it is exactly because we try to avoid the topic that we make the generational gap look bigger. Let me explain. Class may be the most persistent divide in American society, and also the one we're least comfortable talking about. The language of class has never sat easily in the United States. We prefer to talk about opportunity, mobility, and individual effort, even when material outcomes tell a different story. As a result, class differences often get translated into other, more socially acceptable narratives. One of those narratives is generation. Rising house costs, student debt, asset inequality, and uneven access to opportunity don't affect all young people equally. But when class is left unnamed, those differences get absorbed into a broader story about Gen Z versus everyone else. That makes the generational gap appear larger than it really is. In reality, a wealthy Gen Z individual often has more in common with a wealthy Gen X or Boomer than a working class peer of the same age. But when class goes unspoken, generation becomes a stand in, a way to talk about inequality without directly confronting the system that produces it. Like the examples we were giving earlier, right? Rising housing costs. Oh, Gen Z is coming of age at a time where the average age of a first time home buyer is 40. Okay? If housing is that expensive, doesn't it screw over poor millennials as well? Student debt is up. Okay, what about all the people who are trying to go back into college now? Doesn't that screw them as well? Access inequality and assets and all of that, it screws all poor people the same. So when they try to ignore class differences, they hide it behind a veil of Gen Z is growing up with economic woes. They grew up in a world where the cost of groceries was constantly inflating. Well, that's not a Gen Z problem. That's everybody's problem. Because I'm pretty sure boomers still have to eat eggs regardless of how inflated the price is. Alright, I think we're good. I think we can continue the rest of the video without ranting. So, to finish the video, I've created this sort of graph here, at least to wrap it up, bring it back to where we were talking about. This sort of represents my original thesis, where I have it is a bar graph, red being race, blue being gender, green being religion, yellow being class, and pink being the generational difference. On the left, you can see of again, this is just me randomly putting bars down. There's not really any math behind it. The left one shows what you would expect of the difference, how people are dividing each other in the past, right? Now, the right one, you can see the present, where racism, sexism, religious discrimination, etc., still exist and are still actually pretty big, because if you were to stack those three together, it would dwarf the final bar. But what we do see is, even though I did slightly increase the size of the pink one, representing a generational gap, what we see is that slight progress being made again towards racial equality, gender equality, religious equality, etc. A little bit of progress there, and an increase in the difference, class, more economic inequality being masked as a generational problem, and only a very, very, very slight increase in the generational gap has created the appearance of a vastly larger generational gap than there actually is. Now, before completely wrapping up, it's worth addressing a few obvious objections. First, saying some social gaps are shrinking doesn't mean inequality is gone. Racism, sexism, and economic hardship still exist, often in structural rather than personal forms. Second, technology, economics, and recent crises really have shaped Gen Z in unique ways. The differences are real, even if they're not unprecedented. Third, a lot of what feels like generational conflict is amplified by media systems that reward conflict and simplify complex problems into identity narratives. And finally, class and geography still matter enormously. When we don't talk about them directly, generational language just often fills the gap. None of these points contradict the core idea. Together, they actually help explain why generational differences feel so large and why they dominate the conversation right now. Alright, so if this way of thinking about society is useful, I will be coming back to it, especially around how institutions, technology, and generational change interact. I'm already planning another couple of videos with a similar line of thought. If you disagree with anything in the video, I'm more than interested in why. I'm not here to win an argument. So go ahead and leave me a comment down below and I'll get back to you in the next video.